Hey, Wiener-Dog.
Brandon McCarthy?
How's it going?
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
What are you doing here?
Not much, passing through.
Huh.
You look pretty good.
Thanks. You do too.
Weird.
Yeah, I know. I actually tried looking you up on Facebook once.
Oh yeah? Why?
I don't know. I was just surfing around and I don't know, your name. I mean, I've tried looking up other people too.
Like who?
Remember Ralphie?
Thanks, everybody. Todd, it's an honor to have you here. As I said at the beginning of this, you are a man who, for better or worse, has informed my perspective and my sense of humor since I was a kid growing up, back all the way back to Welcome to the Dollhouse. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
So often I feel like a lot of one of the big aspects of your films is sort of presenting an idea that we normally look at one way in very sort of happy, glamorous ways, that the way Hollywood presents it or the way that we want to think of ourselves, whether it's living in suburbia or our jobs or the way that we view sexuality, many different ways. And I'm wondering if the image of the dog, Wiener-Dog, ostensibly the cutest thing that you could possibly have, if that's where that came from you, like presenting an image that we so often hold dear or hold into account one specific way rather than the way that it may actually exist.
Well, it is one of the cutest dogs, and pets, dogs so often are vessels for our hopes, illusions, yearnings, and so forth, and are kind of a projection that we project innocence and even purity onto them, such that were anything bad to happen to a little dog, we have a very keen, emotional, visceral response that sometimes not even one of our fellow humans in peril can rival.
Do you find so often that those projections don't often coincide with our actual behaviors?
Well, in terms of the dog, I mean, it's hard to see a dog as a dog, to see a dog in its dogness, because we're so anthrocentric and we can't help but anthropomorphize. But they can, in some sense, illuminate something about ourselves and our own internal lives and needs.
I think so often you've been called a provocateur, someone who likes to shock. I've never personally found you shocking for the sake to just shock everybody. I've found your tactics or the choices that you make in movies to be proving a point. There are definitely moments in this film, I don't want to give anything away, where you seem to be really making a point in a shocking way because it's a dog, because it's the kind of dog that it is. Were you worried about that? Were you worried about critics once again saying, "Oh, now he's just really trying to shock us"?
Well, I can't really worry about those things. I am very invested emotionally in the lives of my characters, and were I not, I wouldn't go through the ordeal of making these movies. They have always, I've always described them as sad comedies, although this one maybe I call a comedy of despair.
How would you define a sad comedy or a comedy of despair?
Well, I think it's a question of the marriage of comedy and pathos. They are inextricably entwined, and they have been throughout my career, such that some audiences may may laugh and say how funny and true something is, and another half of the audience might be angry at the first half. How can you laugh? This is so sad, so sorrowful. But for me, my response is I look at the comedy and the pathos concurrently. And so the movies are always fraught with ambiguity.
Did you ever have any sort of ambivalence with yourself as a filmmaker and as a storyteller when it came to the kind of audiences that were laughing at the work and maybe how they were laughing at it? I think of a film like the second part of Storytelling and American Scooby, and a lot of that, while many people thought that that was very much a sort of reference to American movie, which it kind of was, that also felt to me very much like you trying to talk about the way people might be laughing at your characters and at your films rather than trying to understand them, just sort of assuming that you were making fun of your characters rather than trying to humanize them.
Yeah, I don't have, no filmmaker has control ultimately over how one's work is perceived. I just find it a little bit reductive to give it a label, whether if people want to say it's just cynical or it's misanthropic. That's fine, but it's not very illuminating. I think that there's more going on there. It's true that laughter is it's a funny thing because I think there are good kinds and kinds that are not so good, and there's a whole spectrum really. And I think we all recognize that when we go to the movies, the way in which people laugh, what they're laughing at, the quality of that laughter, to what extent it's a laughing at, to what extent it's the laughter of recognition and sympathy, or a signal to one's neighbor that, yes, oh, I get it.
How often do you find when your films are called misanthropic, which I completely disagree with, maybe cynical, but I don't think cynical is necessarily misanthropic. I think cynicism is in many ways a humanist approach to sometimes viewing the way that people live. But how often do you find if you watch a big, broad studio comedy that is not labeled as cynical or misanthropic, yet there's a scene in it where, for an example, without even trying to shit on this movie, Daddy's Home, where Will Ferrell goes on a skateboard ramp and shoots up and hits a power line, comes down and dies, and the audience is laughing at that, versus people laughing at the sort of things that are unsaid or between the lines, or the hopes and the ambitions that are falling apart for the people in your movie, which is much more humanistic to me than, I think, Daddy's Home. How do you feel about the culture that responds one way to your film and one way to another film?
Well, I didn't see this movie, but
I assumed that you weren't a big Daddy's Home fan.
I have nothing against it. I don't know this one at all, but movies have different aims, different ambitions. There are all kinds of ways of dealing with calamity and crisis and pain and death and so forth, and sometimes it can be through slapstick just as much as it can come through something much more naturalistic or surreal. There are all kinds of ways of attacking subject matter, and that form doesn't de facto become humanistic or cynical. It's a question of sensibility, and what I'm trying to achieve is just very different from what a filmmaker of a large studio comedy is trying to achieve.
Absolutely. I'm curious, a lot of your films each film deals with many themes, but you seem very set on one theme a lot of the time when it comes to some of your films, at least in my perspective. And I think back to Storytelling, Exploitation, Life During Wartime, Forgiveness, and with this, it's very much about mortality, in my opinion, from what I could gather while I was watching it. It's my own interpretation, my own analysis. What made you so interested in exploring mortality with these stories?
I don't know. It's something that I discovered in the course of writing what I was writing about. Writing it, for me, it's always a process of discovery. as filmmaking is, and self-discovery at that. One thinks one has a sense of where one is going and learns over the course of the process what one is really trying to say. And so it was, I suppose, revealed over the course of writing what really I was getting at, and maybe what I initially thought became something else.
Where did you start with this one in the writing process?
Well, I just wrote from the beginning, and then all the way to the end. I write in a very, I suppose, conventional linear way. And if there's a problem with the motor of the story, I might go back. Certainly, I rewrite all the time up until production or even into post-production.
You outline at all, or do you?
No,
really...
I've never outlined. I've never found that to be useful.
Did you know since you started linearly, did you know when you started that it was going to be 4 stories?
Yeah, I knew I wanted to. I didn't know if it would be 4 or 5. I had to see how it felt. But 4 seemed sufficient. These things are often just very instinctive in the process of putting together your movie. I'm often asked, did the movie turn out the way you planned? And I always say, no, it never does. But if I'm lucky, it turns out better.
Do you feel that way about all your films, that they've turned out better? Or do you look back on any of them and think, well...
I think when I was younger, it was hard for me to focus on the things that I achieved. I was so absorbed and despondent over all the failings and flaws. But as I've gotten older, I've learned to accept that and take pleasure and gratification in what I actually have been able to achieve. And so it's very meaningful to me, very gratifying to me, but I hope I get to continue doing it. I always assume each movie is my last.
And you've said that before, and you've said that it's gotten harder for you to make each movie as well, that your audience has gotten smaller, or because of that the budgets for the movies have gotten smaller. I believe you've said things sort of like this, and since I've read you saying that, I've always wondered why you haven't ventured into TV. The cliche about TV is that it's the writer's medium, it's where all the independent filmmakers are going, but you're such an incredible writer and have such a great ear for dialogue, comic dialogue, sad dialogue. I've never understood why we haven't seen the Todd Solondz TV show, because TV show is such a bad word for it, maybe hour comedy, or it seems like you would be such a great voice to have on television.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I've spoken to some people, and it's possible. I don't rule anything out at all. I grew up on television. I watched, I can remember telling my mom when I was 11, I thought it would please her to let her know I'd only watched 6 hours that day. And then I think at 13 or 14, I went cold turkey and lost all interest in television for many years. But I was shaped primarily through that. I did read, but TV was the main source of dramatic material, because I grew up in the suburbs, and to go to the movies would require transportation. You'd have to get into a car, your mom has to drive, and so forth. And so it was a little bit more of an ordeal. TV's right there. And so it's possible. We'll see.
Danny Devito in this film plays a screenwriter who's a film professor at a school, and his name's Dave Schmertz. Many have said that this seems like a doppelganger for you and maybe your trials and tribulations as a film school professor. Is that true at all? Did you write him to be referential to you?
I don't think anyone who knows me would confuse me with his character. I have great empathy for him and his travails, but I suppose just in the sense that I am a bit of a dinosaur. I mean, I'm much older. I can certainly relate to that in terms of overlap, but. I teach at NYU, the Graduate Film School. I love teaching there. I love the students. I have some wonderful colleagues, and it's also given me a window into learning about just the remarkable incompetence and corruption of the university's Tisch School of the Arts program, and what an evil empire it is, and that probably informed.
Tenured? Are you okay saying?
No, I'm nothing. But it probably informed to some extent a little bit of the satire, but that's in the film. But the movie, that section very much is really just about a man's quest for meaning and redemption.
And I would say Danny DeVito delivers a monologue in that section of the film that's one of the most beautiful pieces of acting I've ever seen Danny DeVito do. It's really incredible. And I think one of the reasons as well that people sort of confuse the doppelganger aspect is that it seems to be slightly self-reflexive in that monologue as well, where he's talking about trying to present his pains, his dreams, but wanting to add some humor. Obviously, he adds more humor than you ever add into your movies. He has like a madcap mobster comedy in his screenplay. But so often it seems like people lose track of all of the ambition of your film, all of the sadness, all of the sort of real talent and ear for how people talk and feel because you love to add some humor. You like to add jokes. You like to find the comedy there as well.
Well, I wouldn't even say that I add humor. Humor is intrinsic to the process of writing. It's not like I write something dramatic and sprinkle it or throw in a few gags or jokes. The comedy is as I say, inextricably tied in to the pathos. I've certainly suggested he's a little bit schlocky in his sensibility, but I think he paid a price in some sense for not trying or investing himself in something more meaningful. And there's something poignant about that for me.
And now in the clip that we saw for the audience, that was Dawn Wiener from the original Welcome to the Dollhouse, but instead of being played by Heather Matarazzo, being played by Greta Gerwig. You've always, over the course of your career, loved sort of shape-shifting and having different actors play characters from before, and even sometimes changing those characters but keeping the same name. How did you go about casting Greta Gerwig when this film was sort of first announced? It was announced mainly as a sequel to Welcome to the Dollhouse.
Yeah, that's what they described it as. I had known Greta a little bit beforehand, and she had auditioned for me on another movie, and I knew that she had the qualities of vulnerability that I was looking for, and so I was very keen to have her if she was available, and fortunately she was. I had killed the character in Palindromes a dozen years ago, and I'd always wanted to have the opportunity to bring her back and offer another life trajectory, another possibility, something a little sunnier, more hopeful. And that's something that I've always been drawn to in my work. You know, as a filmmaker, you have the prerogative and pleasure of creating other lives, and as a filmmaker, also other lives, to the extent that you have actors reprise roles or have other actors take on those roles. And this sense of alternate possibility that haunts and teases all of us in our lives is something I think reflected in my work and crystallized in the scene where Ellen Burstyn looks at all the possible lives she could have led.
Yeah, it's an incredible moment at the end of the film when all those little girls surround her and show her the roads that she hasn't taken. I know Danny DeVito. I talked to Danny DeVito a few months ago, and he said that he had always been trying to work with you, finding a way to work with you. Were you always trying to find a way with Ellen Burstyn? I mean, all of your films are usually just, I mean, for the most part, always incredibly well cast. Everyone seems perfect for those roles.
Well, I've always felt, if you cast the right actor in the right part at the right time, they'll make you look like a better writer and director than you really are.
I want to. You brought up the killing of Dawn Wiener, and I want to bring up the funeral from Palindromes, which to me sort of crystallizes a lot of what you do very well, which is it's the funeral for this young woman who's killed herself. Her mother is crying terribly in the front row. Family is crying, and her brother, in a moment of tribute to her, decides to play a tape of her singing for a talent show when she was younger. And she is just an atrocious singer. And you have this incredible moment where you are, as a viewer, I'm laughing at her singing because it's not very good, but at the same time, all these people are crying for the death of this young woman, who we also know, if we knew the first movie, didn't really treat her as well as she could have been treated. So there's a lot of different sadness, pathos, comedy happening in that scene, yet I've shown that to people who've shown that and been like, that's mean. They've said that he's being really mean in this scene. How that's something, a criticism that I think has plagued you or dominated a lot of your career. How do you respond to someone saying that your work is mean?
Everyone brings a different life experience to a movie in the audience. Everyone has different histories and has absorbed them in different ways. I think it really just comes down to a question of sensibility. If you have trouble with this movie because I love dogs, well, I love dogs too. Or if you say, oh, I love children, how could you? I love children too. I mean, I could say that it's not a question of, oh, I've been through this, I had this horrible experience, so I can't watch that. It's really, it's just the mind is a funny way, the way it contends with all sorts of crises. And so it's always a little bit misleading, a little facile to say, someone was mean to me when I was young, so I can't really deal with this, when for others, that's precisely why they can.
But do you think culturally we're so scared of, or we're so accustomed to sentimentality on the screen and in storytelling that it's almost impossible to view someone not being sentimental as mean or as not mean?
Well, I didn't quite follow the first half.
Do you find that culturally we're so accustomed to sentimentality in our storytelling, especially in movies and on television, that when a filmmaker such as yourself tries to present a reality, an unsentimental reality, that we shirk from it, we can't handle it?
Well, it's always hard to take in something that one is not accustomed to when a person breaks with certain conventions. Our natural impulse is to say, oh, that's wrong, or oh, that's a mistake, or that's not the way things should be. But it requires a certain open-mindedness to say, oh, it didn't turn out the way I thought it would, but wait, maybe this actually touches me in a way I hadn't expected. Certainly, sad endings aren't inherently better than happy endings. The question is, what's a true ending? What's true to the integrity of your material?
The child in this movie who is on the poster right here in the picture behind us has some incredible moments with Tracy Letts and Julie Delpy, and he continues in the tradition of Todd Solondz films of adults really not being able to withstand that well the naive inquisition or interrogation of a child. What is it for you about the sort of questioning that children do that can really sort of open up who an adult actually is? Where do you think you found that as a writer?
Well, I think it's a kind of portal into understanding and undermining certain assumptions that we all take for granted in the way in which we experience and look at the world, that children have the ability to surprise us with very simple questions that open up other big questions. Talking about the nature of pethood and spaying your dog, it makes one question, well, if the world were a little bit different and that there was some superior creature that took over the planet and looked at us as pets and looked at us as their best friend, even though they neutered us. we might have a little bit of a different feeling about this.
And broke our will, as Tracy Lett says in the movie. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. First question.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for being here. How many of the Dachshunds were used in this film, and were there any challenges with them?
There were about 3, 4, 5 that were ultimately used. Some of them were show dogs. And one of the things I learned over the course of making the film from the ASPCA representative, in fact, was that this is because of inbreeding, because of the way these dachshunds are bred for the marketplace, a certain deficit in intelligence has evolved. So what they all had in common was remarkable stupidity, and none of them were able to respond to any of the commands, whether it was stay, sit, so forth. For the interlude, we had the whole crew standing around while the dog tried to walk on the treadmill. But after 3 hours, we did get 12 seconds worth, and so it was an achievement. It was an ordeal, but now that it's over, I'm happy that I have my little dachshunds in there.
Todd's referencing, not to give too much away, there's an incredible interlude in the film where the dog does a sort of old school Western movie travelogue through the country with green screen landscapes behind it and a great Wiener-Dog song playing. It's really, really hilarious. Next question.
Hey Todd, it's great having you here. So I was just wondering, how important was it for you to develop your characters for this movie?
How important was it for me to develop my characters? How important was it to develop my characters? Well, I mean, the character, for me, story and character is the foundation of all movies that interest me. If I weren't invested emotionally in their lives, I certainly wouldn't put myself through this kind of a nightmare.
Dave Schmertz, the screenwriter professor played by Danny DeVito in the movie, has a philosophy, if you will, when it comes to writing a movie. And what is it?
I think he says, "What if, then what?"
And that's as schlocky as he presents it at times. Is that something that you also kind of agree with as a storyteller?
Oh, I think it's a reasonable tool to help students begin to craft their stories. I think he's a better teacher than the students think. I think, though, that he may be a failed screenwriter, filmmaker, what have you, but he has some understanding of the nature of story.
Mm-hmm. Next question. I think this is our last question.
Hi, I wanted to ask you, do you believe that dogs and humans have like a natural connection with each other, or is it something that you have to work on?
Well, I'm not an expert here, but my understanding is that there is a historic evolutionary bonds or between humans and dogs that has developed. I don't know anything. I'm not an anthropologist or a historian or of any sort to speak intelligently about that. But certainly that's the way they've been bred for a long time.
Todd, I want to thank you so much for being here. I love the film so much as I love all of your work. So thanks so much for stopping by and talking to me. Wiener-Dog comes out today, right? It's out in theaters today? All right. Thanks so much, Todd. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.